Okay, this is Generous Theology. I'm Brock, and I'm with my friend Chuck. Thank you for joining us. What a joy, what an honor, a pleasure, and a privilege. Chuck, we're starting today in a new chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. And we're today talking about the content in chapter 32, Theologies of Retrieval. And this is from Professor John Webster. And Chuck, I was very tentative and I think apprehensive about what I thought this chapter might be as I was skimming through it, as I was contemplating what Professor Webster what was his angle, to use a specific term, and where was this going, and why would this be important in a handbook of systematic theology? And I think without, we're going to talk about the contents in the chapter more specifically, but I think at a high level, I can say, after reading, I've been pleasantly surprised for the vast majority of Professor Webster's content here. I was really concerned. I think this turned out to be the kind of chapter that someone like myself can learn a lot from. Having said that, it was really interesting to think about having it in a place like here, the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. It would be, I would say, I'm not aware of very many chapters that are like this in other systematic theologies I've read. And so I think there's an open question that I wanted to check with you and get your opinion on as to whether even this chapter and the topic of this chapter has a place in such a work. Now, I think we're going to probably argue the point both ways. I think points can be made for both. And at the end of the day, I'm not upset that I had to read this chapter. But at the same point in time, while acknowledging the virtues of it, I also am a bit concerned as to what it maybe indicates about where the larger culture perhaps thinks systematic theology have to go. And so that's a broad way of saying this chapter deals a lot with the quote-unquote problem of modernity. And Chuck, you and I have talked about this before. There really is, in an important sense, a struggle to be had in thinking about, as Christians, you and I, thinking about how modernity and now post-modernity are affecting and impacting Christianity as a faith, as a religion. And also there's a challenge here, and it's not particularly subtle or nuanced. Modernity really, in many aspects, seek to perhaps overturn, perhaps reinvent, perhaps reconstruct a Christianity for the modern day. And I think this chapter ends up being very concerned with that. And so that's my high-level overview here. What was up in your mind when you were first reading, when you were first scanning and trying to think about what Professor Webster's thesis was? Did you have concerns, or were you excited by it? What was the approach as you were getting into the chapter with your reading?
Yeah, it was interesting. I noticed, first of all, that John Webster is the first named editor of the whole book. And there is a sense in which, naturally you tend to think, well, he's the primary editor. He's made a lot of editorial decisions about what's going to be in the book. Perhaps we'll get something, related to that out of this particular chapter. Second, it's interesting again, it is the first chapter in this last section on prospects. And in prospects, there are these chapters on, there's revisionism, there's postmodern theology, there's liberation theology, comparative theology, feminist theology. And then this first chapter is this Theologies of Retrieval. So again, you wonder, is this sort of an introductory section to what's to come? What is the purpose of this chapter? And you go into that with that big picture in mind. And then there's the title, Theologies of Retrieval. What is that? What is a theology of retrieval? And for the life of me, before I started reading, I really could not figure out what it was that he might be talking about. Now, I think we now know, having read the chapter, that what he's talking about is retrieving from the past as a way of doing theology. But that was not clear to me. And especially given what we see coming in the rest of this section, it wasn't necessarily what I would have expected either. Now, you also mentioned that there is a sense in which, just the very fact that this chapter and this entire section is included on a handbook on systematic theology is interesting as well. And granted, this is, the Oxford Handbook on Systematic Theology is meant to be that, a handbook, rather than an actual systematic theology. But still, even a handbook on systematic theology is going to at least bear some reflection to what you expect to see in a systematic theology, and having this section on prospects, on what might be coming in the future, what are future ways that we might do theology, it is interesting. And then we start with this first chapter being, hey, we ought to be looking back. We ought not to entirely reject the pre-modern, especially as it relates to the modern. There is some sense in which I think it's interesting to me that, when we get to that chapter on postmodernism, we'll see if some of Webster's ideas that there is some correlation or at least some connection between pre-modern ways of thinking and postmodern ways of thinking. We'll see if that really carries through, because I think we've also seen that not everyone necessarily agrees with that. There's also this idea that postmodernism is just the next step on a pathway away from pre-modernism. So that'll be interesting as well. Webster clearly seems to think that really what at least a portion of postmodernism is trying to do is to reject modernism, and perhaps even in rejecting it be open to pre-modern ways of thinking. And I've heard that from other people, but where I've heard it is not so much as Webster has done it here, which is to almost make a theological, philosophical case for it. And where I've heard it more is from people who just say it's an opportunity. If postmodernism is a lot about questioning modernism, maybe we ought to be taking the opportunity to provide answers from the past. And to some extent, that's a little bit what Webster is doing as well. But it was, frankly, the first few pages had me a little bit like going back, reading the paragraph over again, reading it a third time, reading it a fourth time. What is it that he's getting at? But eventually, I would agree with you that there was much that was very interesting and also potentially very useful in this particular chapter.
Thank you, my friend. I think maybe to start unpacking the chapter, I think we're going to start in my initial examination here. We're going to start with the ending and work back towards the beginning. And so in section 4, the conclusion, some of the things that the professor has to say is he says this. He says the major achievements of theology in the mode of retrieval have been to commend a more celebratory style of theological portrayal and to rehabilitate classical sources of Christian teaching and draw attention to their potential in furthering the theological task. For systematic theology, now this is the sentence, this suggests that exegetes and historians often prove more congenial and valuable neighbors than critical philosophers. And I think that's a conclusion I can amen. One of the challenges in assessing the modern period is to wonder how to place these challenges in their proper place and give them a proper due, while also not potentially compromising an authentic faith that comes to us from the past and is meant to be received, perhaps more than it is meant to be reconstructed. So what do I mean by that? Well, whether it's Schleiermacher or whether it's Diderot or whether it's any hundreds of others of modern thinkers, one thing that strikes me over and over again is this insistence that the thing that has come to us from the past, that in centuries in the pre-modern era, the Christianity that has come and that has been received by the culture of its day has been received. Now, in the challenge to modernity, I think about Schleiermacher, I think about Diderot, I think about Kant, I think about Schelling, Hegel, Marx, so many other thinkers. And I'm struck by this idea that they almost all had, to some degree or another, a fundamental problem with doing that, with simply receiving the Christianity of the past. And almost all of them, through the use of new methods, new critical approaches, new dialectical ways of thinking about things that were built upon a fundamentally new metaphysic. I think I really have to ask myself, is there blessing in the modern project? Now, if I only focus on these thinkers, I think the answer probably has to be no in the long term. My evaluation is that most of the thinkers who are associated with the modern periods in these ways come from a background of an explicit rejection. And so for them, it's reconstruction. For them, it's alienation with that past. For them, it's a hard no, that pre-modern Christianity in the various flavors that it came in the pre-modern Christian West. There is to be no reconciliation with that. Now, there are other people who have lived during modern times and who have written as moderns to some degree, who have not espoused this approach. And so I think the jury is still out, and I think we can investigate and talk with them about their push. Hey, we need something new. We need to rethink, we need to re-examine, we need to reconstruct Christianity, but not because we're ultimately rejecting the pre-modern thing, but because we stand outside of it, stand in a new era, a new world that has been affected so much by modernity. So as a result, Christianity of the past is as difficult to understand and relate to as, let's say, Middle English or Shakespearean English is to be understood by today's English speakers and readers. Now, I can sympathize with someone who says that. In my own personal ministry, I love to use the King James Version of the Bible. It has a majesty of language that is very pleasing, and I believe very edifying. And there is a spirit of Christianity that is conveyed by that work that, well, I would hate to see that spirit ultimately vanquished from the English-speaking world. And yet, Chuck, when I minister to folks about the contents of the gospel, I find myself turning to other translations. And so I can sympathize with the modern who says, I'm having a hard time understanding Christianity when I read Middle English Bible translations and when I read pre-modern systematic theology. I can understand and sympathize and empathize with that task. I think the problem is, how do we do this without accepting the pill that seems to always be associated with the modern dialectic steps, which is namely the synthesis with unbelief, the synthesis with critical methods, and the synthesis with this turn to self, the phenomenal turn to self. And so that seems a bridge too far. So, Chuck, Professor Webster is going to have a lot to say about the landscape here. And it seems to me that he does well. It is a complicated landscape, but I think those key factors are the big struggles that I have here. And so with that in mind, how did it hit you? How closely do these categories come up in your thinking? And where do you feel a theology of retrieval might actually be beneficial for Christians?
Yeah, first of all, it may be, a reflection of my own biases or my own way of thinking, but there is a sense in which when Webster made that comment about historians proving to be more congenial and valuable neighbors than critical philosophers, I resonated with that, in part because, if you give me a historian to read versus a critical philosopher, and you just tell me, pick one, you can pick whatever you want, it's okay, which one are you going to take? I'm probably going to read the historian. I really enjoy history. And I tend to, and I was reminded of this, at my workplace, we all of us who are considered department heads had to do something called the Clifton Strengths Finders, which is the Gallup Polls organization has this where organizations can pay to have people do these personality tests. But unlike some of the personality tests that are really more about what is your personality, the Enneagram or the TI, those kinds of things, it really gets to what are your strengths in the workplace. And, a number of questions are asked, which you have to say, I fall more on one side more than the other side, although some of the questions really aren't questions that are naturally on one side or another of a pole. You just have to figure out where to put yourself. And from there, they make certain determinations. And one of the things that I guess I probably knew about myself, but the Clifton Strengths Finders said about me, was that I tend to look to both the successes of the past as well as the failures of the past as a way of helping to plot out a future track. And I think that's true. People joke around at City Hall about that. Well, if you want to know why we did something a certain way 20 years ago, go ask Chuck. He'll probably tell you. And, it helps to have been around for 27 years now in that workplace and longer than most people. And so there is a sense of that. But it's often as well, I find myself doing it not just simply as well, this is what we did 20 years ago. This was the change that was made at this particular time that reflects what we're doing now. But a lot of times it is really about the why did we make the particular change? What was happening at the time that led us to make a particular change? And would that, and then thinking about going forward, is that make sense going forward? Are we in the same circumstance? Do we have, just to name a particular issue that we have going on, is the fact that we created a city administrator position because of issues we were having with a mayor who, had great difficulty with alcohol and was making the city look bad on television and radio because of that. Now that we're re-looking at the city administrator position, given that we're not in that circumstance, how might we redesign that a little bit differently for today's circumstances? And I tend to do that in my theology as well. I will often look at historical traditions and look at why things are a certain way. Obviously, as Reformed folks, we often look back to the Reformation, both Luther's Reformation and then the later, the Calvin and the things that he said. And we look to those times as being really helpful to help us understand why we are where we are. But there's also been now in more recent years a move to go back even further and look at some of the the ancient writers, the ancient fathers, and look at what was their circumstance and what were they doing and try to apply some of those things to things going on today. So there is a piece at which that as I read what he's doing here, it makes a lot of sense to me. One thing I did want to know, and since we're going backwards, I don't have an issue with doing this. In that last section, Webster talks about a few potential issues with theologies of retrieval, which I think are worth noting. One, he says, is that if we really understand the history of orthodoxy in a providential way, we can sometimes miss what was really going on behind the scenes. And he calls them the processes of negotiation, which are part of the doctrinal life of the Christian tradition. And especially when deployed in reaction to an apparently unyielding ideology of criticism, which we certainly are dealing with, the tradition might easily be viewed as a fully realized whole rather than as an unfinished assemblage of products, however providentially ordered. I thought that was really helpful to think about, right? There is a tendency, I think, to sometimes, given that we have this unyielding ideology of criticism, of modernity that is really attacking, more orthodox ways of thinking as a whole, it is tempting for us to just think of, the theologies of the past as just being this whole, right? When actually what is happening is over time there had been back and forth. It is interesting to read about, what was going on at the time of the various councils, the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. It's interesting to read about, what were some of the conversations that were happening around the time of the Synod of Dort, and, why did certain things go in a particular direction? In my own tradition, there's often a little bit of a, we look at the Heidelberg Catechism, which was written in a somewhat different context than, our Presbyterian brothers and sisters who use the Westminster Confession as their primary catechism. And, why might we see some of those differences? And if we ignore those things and we think of it as just one big solid whole, we may actually miss some important texture that would really be helpful in doing theology and studying, God's word. And then he says a further temptation for theologians of retrieval is to subscribe to a myth of the fall of theology from Christian genuineness at some point in its past. And he names different places where people put that. Maybe it's 14th century nominalism, or maybe it's 16th century Reformation, or 17th century Cartesianism, or whenever it was that modernity is considered to have first presented itself. And I think I see that happening too in my own tradition. Sometimes it's Calvin's Geneva that sort of is held up as, well, that's the perfect, that's the model. And of course, we know that things weren't perfect in Calvin's Geneva. There were things that happened at that time which we would say, no, we disagree with a few of those things, even if we would be happy with much of what Calvin was preaching at that time. Similarly, it seems like there is sort of a growing culture among younger Reformed folks who really look at the Puritans as the peak of sort of Christianity. And of course, that's not necessarily the case either. There were certainly issues going on during the days of the Puritans. In fact, some things that probably led to some of the issues that we have today that we have to take into account. So again, even as we hold up writers and thinkers from the past as being people we ought to be learning from, people we ought to be standing on the shoulders of, we can't make the mistake of idealizing that either. We're still in a fallen world, and we're, there is still a place for learning. There is still a place for semper reformanda, right? There's always a place for always reforming, even if we don't always agree, even if we're concerned about where some of the change has led to in the past. And concern about the changes that led to modernism shouldn't cause us to say, well, we should never change. Rather, they should lead us to change in ways that are more faithful to the scripture.
Amen, my friend. Amen. I like that build out. There is something that I'd like to say here that can sound, well, let me back up. Unfortunately, in a tactical sense, Chuck, in rhetoric, to say that the person on the other side of an issue from you makes good points. Well, first of all, that's a very high bit of interactions to have, because in public settings, that's generally perceived as a weakness. That's generally perceived as an admission that the criticism has carried from the other side. And the inability to have those kinds of discussions really leads to it being harder for a society to move forward in maturity. And there's so much of an issue of simply being at each other's throats instead of finding a way to positively move forward. And so in that sense, I want to embrace dialectic steps. I think that we can and should accept some degree of critical methods. There are lots of things that non-believers say about the Christian faith that are true, that we who are Christians would really benefit from. Our Christianity would improve by acknowledging what's being said and, quote unquote, critically reflecting upon it and speaking in a wholesome way. Now, one of the concerns here, and I'm looking for my quote. I just had it and then I moved away from it. It'll come back to me here, I'm sure. But there's a part in Webster's chapter where he talks about it being important to theology has to renegotiate. And through that process of renegotiation, this alienation between the two sides can be successfully resolved, or at least has the potential to be successfully resolved. And I say yes and amen to that in a generous sense. I think the thing that I'm concerned about here, and this is not a fault or a limitation of Professor Webster or his thesis, I think it's something that any Christian who is pressed upon by the modern stimulus has to deal with. And that's the idea of just what in Christianity can be, quote unquote, renegotiated. And I would say there's this, loosely speaking, there's this idea that there are accidentals, there are circumstances of Christianity that are time sensitive, that are culture specific. And I think there is a great degree of renegotiation that is allowable there. What time do we have the worship service? What should a church worship service look like in terms of a sanctuary? What color is the carpet? Do we have a meal before? Do we have a meal after? Do we have no meal at all associated with the worship service? What's the state of dress for the presenters, the music team, the preacher, the choir, worship leaders, etc.? Should there be a national flag in the sanctuary? Should there not be a national flag in the sanctuary? Should there be images in the sanctuary? Should there be no images? We can talk about, and I think it's fair to renegotiate lots of circumstances. However, having said that, when I interact with so much of the modern push, the modern attack, the modern, hey, we need to renegotiate, I find that the renegotiations are being asked in areas that are not simply circumstantial, but are in fact key elements of the Christian faith. And if those elements are quote unquote renegotiated, then I think there's reason to suppose that the synthesis has ceased to be Christian, or at the very least is in a great danger of it. And so I'll just throw some ideas out, Chuck, and not meaning to be controversial, but nevertheless having to say it. It's very clear that moderns and now postmoderns wish to renegotiate what is marriage. And there is a strong push. The traditional definition will not be acceptable. And so you, Mr. Churchman, have to renegotiate with me. Same thing. What is a man? What is a woman? I'm not speaking with any leftists who feel that the issue is merely one of alienation. Oh, well, we're not quite in sync with the pre-modern position. Instead, the issue is we are opposed to the particular doctrine that's traditionally associated with the pre-modern position. And we cannot move forward in fellowship until you pre-moderns accommodate. So we see, what is a woman? What is a man? What does it mean to be those? Think of issues related to race, issues related to LGBT, issues related to feminism. Those are all controversial. Think about issues even related to a prima facie understanding of the nature of reality. And here I'm thinking about evolution versus creationism. When the modern comes and knocks on the door, hey, we want to participate in your fellowship. In fact, we believe we have a right to participate in your fellowship. However, with that participation must come an affirmation of some form of Darwinian evolutionism. Same thing with critical race theory and other Marxist methods. There are people who are saying, well, listen, here is CRT. Here are some Marxist approaches to understanding that might provide insight. But in fact, the Overton window around such discussions tends to be there is no other set of tools in the pre-modern's bag of tools that are acceptable. One can only look at things through the lens of CRT or some of these other Marxist methods. And so in that particular sense, there really does seem to be that seems to be where the quote unquote fight is. And by the way, there are many professing Christians who have decided, well, I'm with the moderns here. Yes, let's renegotiate what marriage is. Yes, let's renegotiate what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. Yes, let's renegotiate around a particular level of acceptance associated with LGBT issues. Yes, we have to completely revamp when it comes to the critiques from feminism. Of course, you can't be a thinking man and not believe in Darwinian evolutionism. And that's just a given there. And so this is a real interesting situation. And so we have a little bit of the former. We have some people who wish to renegotiate in areas that are very circumstantial. But really the key thrust that I'm most concerned with are the folks who wish to renegotiate the actual elements of the Christian faith and religion. And I think Professor Webster here, I think I would have loved to have seen a recognition from the professor's part that in some sense there are some parties with whom we cannot negotiate some certain issues. And with that in mind, that potentially causes the whole approach to be in doubt, because that very oftentimes that's where things really do boil down to. And Chuck, that was a long way of saying something that I know could have been said better shorter. So thank you for your patience there. What do you think about that part? And is the criticism toward Professor Webster Is it a fair one? Is it warranted? How does that strike you? And where does the theologies of retrieval fit in light of those things?
I think one of the most important words that you used, as does Professor Webster at times, in talking about this process is negotiation. And he uses that several times throughout, from the very beginning. And I think it may have been the very use of that word that led me at first to not be certain about where he was going, to not entirely understand the project, what he meant by Theologies of Retrieval. And in the end, perhaps gets at some of the weakness here of the discussion. And I think you using that term negotiate hits on part of the problem. So let me describe it this way. So sometimes, one of the roles that my office fulfills is prosecution of non-criminal offenses, code violations, traffic violations, but they can, in Wisconsin, drunk driving, at least a first offense, is non-criminal. And it's up to that sort of level. And, we often think of attorneys as doing negotiation, right? You're doing plea negotiations, trying to get to a particular point. And negotiation is often used to describe a process whereby you have an end point that you're going to get to. And it's an endpoint that's negotiated, and that, there's always sort of the trope that if neither side is entirely happy, that's probably the best solution to a negotiation. I think that also happens a lot of times in some of the other work I do, whether it's, doing development work in the city, for example, where you're maybe negotiating a contract to have a new business come in and, build a corporate headquarters in your industrial park that you're developing, things like that, where again, you're negotiating. Negotiating assumes that you're trying to get to a particular point. Maybe neither side will be entirely happy with that point, but if you get somewhere where neither is entirely happy, you're probably at the right point. There's a sense in which I think negotiation is never really what we should be doing when it comes to doing theology. And I compare it to this. So I have to be careful about what I say, but because this is an ongoing case. But I have an attorney here in town that I've been working with who I have a great deal of respect for. And he represents a young client who has, let's just say, a raft of violations. None of them are in the criminal level, but obviously some ongoing issues. And issues that probably suggest that there may be, beyond just simply the legal issues that are going on, there are some other issues that really need to be dealt with. And one of the times when we got together to talk, we basically agreed this is not going to be a negotiation. We're not going to negotiate today. Instead, we're just going to talk. We're going to talk about the circumstance. We're going to talk about the situation. We're going to get a sense a little bit of where each side is coming from in the circumstance. What do we think the problems are? What do we think, needs to be dealt with without necessarily getting directly to that? I think that ended up being a very useful process for us because we weren't so focused on the idea that there had to be an ending point, probably an ending point that neither of us is going to entirely like, but an end point nonetheless. But rather, we were actually doing much more communication about, what are our goals here? What is it that we are most concerned about here? Now, those things may at some point, as far as the legal process, may lead to a better set of negotiations and perhaps an ending point where both sides, even if they're not entirely happy, are perhaps somewhat less unhappy than they might have been. But that just simply discussion without negotiation strikes me to some extent as being a little bit more like what we ought to be doing when we're dealing with others in talking about theology and talking about dogmatics and talking about, these various issues that we've been talking about. Because a discussion, doesn't necessarily have an end in mind, because there may not be a way as part of those discussions to come to an agreement, right? In a legal negotiation, at some point, there does have to be an ending point. Somebody at the end, there has to be sort of a settlement. Cases can't go on forever. But that's not necessarily the case when we're dealing with, let's say, modernists. Do we actually have to come to some sort of conclusion where the modernists aren't entirely happy, but neither are we? No, I don't think so. Now, is there some benefit from having those discussions? Are there things that we can learn from having those discussions? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, whether we're talking to people who, have different views than we might on LGBT issues, on gender roles, on, racial issues in the community, that those kinds of things, there are things that I think may allow us, without necessarily giving up on our, guns, or, that are things that we're just never going to give up on, but we may still learn some perspectives that may be helpful. For example, in my denomination right now, there is a lot of discussion going on over the role of LGBT folks in the church, and what does that mean for our confessions. And I think it's fair to say that, I think while, and our denomination did create a report that the majority report basically indicated we were not going to move from more traditional views of sexuality. But I think there was something to be learned as far as, well, how can we learn to be not necessarily accepting of views that we cannot accept, but how can we be more neighborly? How might the church, react to people who end up in our midst who may believe differently? What happens when, a lesbian couple, say, ends up in the pews of your congregation, and how do you minister to them? I think there are some things that we can learn by having those discussions without a set ending point, not negotiations, but just discussions over these issues. And then by not calling them negotiations, I think we remain free at that point to say, but we may never come to some sort of actual agreement, nor is it ever our intent to do, but rather our intent is actually to listen and learn. It may change some things. That's possible. We're always reforming, but there are certain fences that we're not going to cross. You often use that term, the Overton window, and I know it has a particular meaning, but I think perhaps there is a sense in which having those discussions that are not negotiations are about recognizing that we have certain windows that will accept too, and that those windows are not the same as the windows of people, who may come from other perspectives. There may be some places where they overlap. That's possible. There may be some places where there's no overlap, and the windows are in just entirely different places. And, maybe that's not all that bad. It's a way of separating ourselves. And there's certainly a sense, I think, that when we read scripture, that as much as we are in the world, as much as we're called to be in the world, there is also a separation as well. As Christians, we are different from the principalities and powers. We're different from the world around us. And so there may come some points where we're going to have places where those windows just simply don't overlap. And that's okay. We're not negotiating to try to find an overlap. We're not negotiating to move our windows to be in exactly the same place. But that doesn't mean we don't talk to each other. It doesn't mean that we don't learn from each other. It doesn't mean that we don't respect the arguments that each makes. But respect doesn't have to mean, accepting or, swallowing up, the particular views that we just feel aren't a part of where we can go. And I felt that to some extent, Webster's use of that term negotiation in the end might have led to a little bit of confusion I had at first, and still, even though I did, feel strongly that there was much good out of this chapter, much that I appreciated, an appreciation for the idea that there is this sense of theologies of retrieval. It's probably a good thing that they're out there, but I might have, if I were editing the book and Webster were writing for me, I might say, what do you mean by negotiating? And is that really the word that you want to use? And maybe it was, but that would then also lead us to potentially to some other discussion. What do you think? Does my sort of concern about that word negotiate, does that hit it all with you?
Chuck, I think that, first of all, I want to thank you for responding in a sensitive fashion to what can easily go off the rails and get very heated. I would say that one of the interesting possibilities here is this idea, is the very fundamental idea of how and on what basis can any society function. And so much of the modern movements are an attempt to ground, as Professor Webster talks about with respect to Jungel's idea, this modern grounding of thought in the Cartesian cogito is the initiation of the destruction of the metaphysically based certainty of God. Now, what's happening there? I think there's this idea that much of Reconstructionism is coming from a place where there is an assumption that we need to reconstruct precisely because what is currently there and built and based on the traditional values and categories is not redeemable. Now, Chuck, we can imagine a situation in a society where a bridge or a highway overpass or, some other shared public resource, it just comes to a place where it's no longer salvageable, and the bridge needs to be taken down and perhaps and presumably rebuilt. And I think everybody can acknowledge that in the abstract. I think where this gets difficult is when we leave the idea of, hey, this bridge has deteriorated beyond repair. When we move from that and instead move in the direction of we have to think about reality in this new way. We have to have these new dictionaries, and that's going to be the challenge. And I don't think there's any one quote unquote method. So there's no algorithm, I think, that just we can put things on autopilot and society will just sort itself out and the various factions will just magically come to agree with each other in a positive and winsome way. Now, having said that, there really is a need to coexist. And I think this might be a triumph of modernism. As we move from the modern ideas of coexistence, of multiplicity of values, of a mixed society, as we move into that, I think that I'm in a large way convinced that we're in this new world and that it's important for Christians to not simply assume the positions of power, assume the positions that, Chuck, you and I have the special trump cards that we get to play in public policy discussions that no one else has access to. So in that sense, I think there was a critique that the moderns carried off and ultimately succeeded with. Now, having said that, I still believe, Chuck, in the quote unquote rightness of the pre-modern Christian categories. But having said that, I'm happy to have this discussion in the marketplace of ideas. And so in that sense, maybe there's another way in which this pre-modern has been affected by modernism. I think some of the concerns I have is what reconciliation can happen between parties who are in some sense fundamentally opposed. And so Webster talks about Jungel and this idea of a modern thesis that says this: the traditional categories are, quote, an internally corrupt tradition which lacks access to the resources needed to maintain integrity under interrogation, unquote. Now, I think I've heard that from many moderns, many secularized, secularistic, phenomenal thinking moderns. And here's what they say: Christianity does not withstand our scrutiny, and it's internally corrupt, it's inauthentic, it's just not scientific. Whatever it is that wishes to be said in that favor. And I find most of those accusations overstated. And I think my fear is that as a student of history, as unsavory as much of Christian history has been, I think there are reasons to suppose that it is not, that secularization is not in and of itself progress. And with that in mind, I think we Christians need to have an awareness. I think we need to be on our toes. And I think we have to have an answer to the accusations of the modern secularist. Even if we do not criticize the secularist, I think we need to have answers that have some degree of integrity. And then we have to leave the rest to God. So there is, I think, room for a theology of retrieval. Now, here's the interesting thing. This goes back to the intuition that you articulated at the beginning, which was to say this: Webster is the organizing editor for this volume, and part 4, the prospects, in some sense represents a most important section. In other words, the other 3 parts can have other duty in terms of advancing the systematic. But part 4, the prospects, really do seem to be about reconstructing or course correcting or reimagining Christianity in ways that the participants, the professors who've written their essays, think is going to be an improvement. And so this is going to come around, like you said, chapters about revisionism, about postmodern theology, about liberation theology, about comparative theology, about feminist theology. There could just as easily have been LGBT, a chapter on that, the theology associated with that. And Chuck, here's the thing. I see no chapters here in the prospects section that says we need to course correct back toward more traditional modes of thinking. And so in that sense, I think this prospects section is possibly tipping its hand. If all of the course correcting needs to be done in one direction and not the other, then that starts to look imbalanced. And I don't see here prospects section that deal with, traditional ideas of the scriptures, traditional ideas of different systematic understandings. Let's say, for example, Roman Catholic, Reformed, Greek Orthodox. This all looks to be one way, namely away from the pre-modern. Now, maybe the chapters are more nuanced than that, but on the other hand, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and quacks like a duck, maybe it is a duck. So that's where I'm looking at here, Chuck. Let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts.
Yeah, and I agree with you that it's, on the one hand, it's interesting that the Theologies of Retrieval is first. On the other hand, it is also interesting that what comes next is very different. And in fact, I've read the next chapter already, the chapter on revisionism. And I don't know if you have yet as well, but I suspect your reaction will be similar to mine, which is that the reaction to it is very different than the chapter we just read, and with some much greater concern going forward. Now, again, it may be that you present these things as things that are out there, but if that's the case, if the prospects chapter is not prescriptive but rather descriptive, and we don't know one way or the other, but if it's descriptive, it tells us something about what is really out there, right? That there's only one chapter on going back to the pre-modern, and a series of other chapters that either extend the modernist project or go to a postmodernist project that seems, at least from first glance, to be very different from where we might want to see postmodernism going. And of course, if it's prescriptive, that's even more of a concern, because then, despite the fact that you have Webster as the primary editor of this book, writing that particular chapter, if it's really meant to be prescriptive, then, and it's only one of 5 or 6, that says something about what's being prescribed as well. So I would share your concerns and in that regard. Obviously, I think it may be worth. It doesn't mean that it's not worth reading these other sections. I think there are things, as we talked about, that we might learn even from revisionism or from these other theologies. But again, we need to be careful about whether we're actually entering into negotiations, because if we enter into negotiations, potentially we could lose what we have, and we don't want. I'm glad we have these chapters to read. There's a sense in which engaging with them in this way and then having the opportunity to talk, is perhaps a safer way of dealing with these things than just simply entering into negotiation.